What if you could step into the shoes of someone who saw the world for the very first time? Picture the moment when the first human laid eyes on a distant mountain range, crossed a raging river, or stood at the edge of an endless ocean. No maps, no guides, just sheer determination and an unshakable curiosity. That's the spirit we're about to explore in these 35 fascinating tales of ancient explorers and pioneers. These weren't just travelers, they were visionaries who pushed beyond the edges of the known world, risking everything to uncover what lay beyond the horizon. And their stories, they're not just dusty relics of the past. They're alive with lessons about courage, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit. Think about the last time you felt truly awestruck, maybe standing beneath a starry sky or witnessing a breathtaking landscape. Now imagine that feeling multiplied 1,000-fold, because that's what these explorers experienced every time they discovered something no one from their world had ever seen. From the Phoenicians navigating by the stars to the Polynesians crossing vast oceans in outrigger canoes, these pioneers didn't just move from point A to point B. They rewrote the boundaries of what was possible. And here's the thing, their journeys weren't just about geography. They were about the clash and fusion of cultures, the exchange of ideas that would shape civilizations, and the sheer audacity to ask, what's out there? So why do these stories still matter today? Because they're not just history, they're the foundation of our modern world. Every time you look at a map, board a plane, or even scroll through satellite images on your phone, you're benefiting from the legacy of these ancient trailblazers. Their triumphs and tragedies, their discoveries and dead ends, they all weave together into a tapestry of human progress. And over the next 35 tales, we'll walk in their footsteps, from the scorching sands of the Sahara to the frozen tundras of the Arctic, uncovering the secrets of those who dared to go first. This isn't just a journey through time. It's an invitation to see the world through the eyes of the boldest souls who ever lived, ready to begin. Long before satellites charted every inch of our planet, a Carthaginian admiral named Hano set sail into the unknown with 60 ships and thousands of settlers, determined to establish new colonies along Africa's western edge. But what began as a practical mission soon transformed into one of history's most extraordinary adventures. Imagine the scene, creaking wooden vessels hugging unfamiliar shores, crews whispering about strange fires glowing in the distance, and the unsettling roar of creatures unlike anything they'd ever heard. Hano's log, preserved on a temple wall in Carthage, reads like a thrilling blend of explorer's diary and ancient mystery novel. He describes towering flames erupting at night, likely the volcanic peaks of Mount Cameroon, and encounters with hairy, wild people, his interpreters called gorillas. Were these actually the great apes we know today, or a now extinct tribe? The ambiguity only deepens the intrigue. What's truly remarkable is how Hano's journey reflects the collision of curiosity and caution that defined early exploration. Every new bay or river mouth presented a choice: play it safe by turning back, or push forward into lands where maps offered only blank spaces and rumors of monsters. His account mentions a place he called the Island of the Gods, where drums echoed through the jungle at night. To modern ears, it sounds like a campfire tale, but to Hano, it was real. This tension between observation and legend makes his story so compelling. Later Greek and Roman scholars would treat his writings as both geography lesson and cautionary fable, debating whether his burning mountains were gateways to the underworld or natural wonders. Hano's legacy isn't just about miles traveled, it's about the ripple effect of his discoveries. When Portuguese sailors like Diogo Cao began probing Africa's coast 2,000 years later, they carried fragments of Hano's lore with them. His voyage became a benchmark, proving that the so-called edge of the world was anything but empty. Even his failures held lessons. Colonies abandoned due to disease or conflicts taught later explorers the value of local knowledge. So the next time you glance at a map of Africa, remember, those coastlines were first traced by pioneers like Hano, who sailed not just for glory or gold, but for the simple, audacious reason that the horizon existed. While Hano was charting Africa's fiery coast, another explorer was venturing into a world of ice and endless daylight. Pythias, a Greek from the bustling colony of Massalia, modern-day Marseille. Picture this, a man raised under Mediterranean suns where the sea was warm and the nights were short, daring to sail northward into waters so cold they seemed like another planet. In the 4th century before the Common Era, when most Greeks believed the world ended somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Pythias set out to prove them wrong. His voyage wasn't just a physical journey, it was a leap into the unknown, challenging everything his civilization thought it knew about the edges of the earth. What Pythias encountered would have sounded like pure myth to his contemporaries. He wrote of a place where the sun never set in summer, painting the sky in perpetual gold, a phenomenon we now recognize as the midnight sun near the Arctic Circle. He described seas choked with ice, where the water itself seemed to solidify into jagged mountains. Most astonishing of all were his accounts of the aurora borealis, those shimmering curtains of light dancing across the northern sky. To the Greeks, these tales were too fantastical to believe. Later scholars like Strabo dismissed Pythias as a liar, claiming no civilized man could survive such horrors. But time has a way of vindicating visionaries. Modern archaeology and climate data suggest Pythias likely reached Norway or even the fringes of the Arctic, making him the first Mediterranean traveler to document these wonders with startling accuracy. What makes Pythias's journey so extraordinary isn't just the distances he covered, it's how his observations shattered ancient worldviews. Before him, the far north was a blank space filled with monsters and chaos in Greek imagination. After his voyage, it became a real place, one where nature behaved differently but by knowable rules. His calculations of latitude using the sun's angle were groundbreaking, laying the foundation for scientific geography. He even noted the relationship between the moon and ocean tides, a connection most Mediterranean sailors had never noticed because their nearly tideless sea hid the pattern. Yet Pythias's greatest legacy might be his courage to trust his own eyes over centuries of tradition. When he met the Britons, he didn't describe them as barbarians but as skilled farmers who harvested wheat and brewed honey mead. His reports of tin mining in Cornwall became a roadmap for later traders, and that frozen sea everyone mocked him for describing. It became a beacon for future explorers, from the Vikings to modern scientists studying climate change. Pythias teaches us that discovery isn't just about reaching new places, it's about seeing the familiar world with fresh eyes, even when others refuse to believe what you've seen. His story whispers across the ages. The truth is often found where the maps end. Zhang Cayenne's journey began with a simple mission: find allies against the fierce Xiongnu nomads threatening China's borders. But history has a way of turning straightforward plans into epic sagas. Captured almost immediately by the very people he was sent to outmaneuver, Zhang spent 10 years living among the Xiongnu, far from the ordered courts of the Han Dynasty. Instead of despairing, he did something extraordinary. He turned captivity into curiosity. While his guards assumed he'd resigned himself to a life on the steppes, Zhang was quietly studying their ways, their horsemanship, their tribal alliances, even the routes they used to trade with distant lands. When he finally escaped, he didn't rush home. He pressed westward, driven by whispers of civilizations beyond China's wildest imaginings. The world he discovered would have stunned his contemporaries. In the fertile Fergana Valley, he saw horses so powerful they seemed to sweat blood, the legendary Fergana steeds, unmatched in battle. In Bactria, he encountered Greek-influenced cities, remnants of Alexander the Great's long-vanished empire, where merchants traded goods from even farther west. For a man raised in a society that believed China was the pinnacle of civilization, these encounters were revolutionary. His detailed reports described grapes, alfalfa, and glassware, items utterly foreign to the Han court. But Zhang's greatest revelation wasn't the exotic goods. It was the realization that these distant lands were eager for Chinese silk, a fabric they prized above gold. The dangers he faced read like a thriller: sandstorms that buried caravan trails, bandits lurking in mountain passes, and the constant threat of being recaptured by the Xiongnu. At one point, he survived by drinking rainwater from hollowed-out horse hooves. Yet every hardship served a purpose. When Zhang finally returned to China after 13 years, long after he'd been presumed dead, his maps and stories ignited an imperial obsession. Emperor Wu saw what others missed. These weren't just tales of strange lands. They were blueprints for an economic revolution. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes linking east and west, wasn't built in a day. But it was Zhang's gritty perseverance that laid the first stones. His legacy, a lesson in turning setbacks into stepping stones. The Xiongnu had tried to silence him. Instead, they'd given him a front-row seat to the wider world. Those blood-sweating horses he brought back, they transformed China's cavalry, helping secure its borders. The grapes he introduced, they became imperial delicacies. But beyond goods and weapons, Zhang Cayenne's true gift was a shift in mindset. Before him, China saw itself as isolated. After him, it saw itself as part of a vast, interconnected web, one where a single determined traveler could change the course of history. The Silk Road didn't just carry silk and spices. It carried ideas, religions, and technologies that shaped civilizations for centuries. And it all began with a diplomat who refused to let captivity define his story. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. That's a lesson the Romans learned brutally in the year 19 before the Common Era, when an entire legion, some say as many as 5,000 men, marched into the Sahara's embrace and never returned. Their mission: to find Garama, the legendary capital of the Garamantes, a wealthy kingdom rumored to control trade routes dripping with gold and ivory. But the Sands had other plans. For centuries, this vanished expedition lived on only in fragments of gossip and half-whispered accounts, until archaeologists began piecing together a chilling trail of clues. A rusted helmet here, a scattering of coins there, all leading deeper into the void where Rome's reach abruptly ended. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the scale of the loss, it's how ordinary their final moments might have been. Imagine soldiers used to the cool shade of Mediterranean olive groves now trudging through dunes that stretched like an oven's breath. Their armor, designed for European battles, would have become torture under the Saharan sun. Then there's the silence: no birds, no streams, just the groan of shifting sand and the creak of leather straps. The artifacts tell a grim tale: a spearhead found near a dried-up oasis, its tip broken as if used to dig for water that wasn't there. A handful of coins minted with Emperor Augustus's face, scattered where someone might have dropped them in panic, and most telling of all, the absence of mass graves. This wasn't a battle, it was a slow unraveling where the desert itself became the enemy. But here's the twist modern archaeology reveals: the Romans might have been closer to Garama than they thought. Satellite images now show the Garamontes didn't just survive in the desert, they thrived, thanks to an ingenious network of underground tunnels called fogaras that tapped hidden aquifers. Their cities were lush islands in the sands, proof that what seemed like a wasteland to outsiders was a home to those who understood its secrets. So did the Legion perish just miles from salvation, unaware of the civilization hidden beyond the next dune? Or did they stumble into Garama only to meet a different fate at the hands of warriors protecting their kingdom? The real tragedy of this lost expedition isn't just their failure, it's how close they came to rewriting history. Had they returned, Rome might have gained a foothold in Africa's heart, altering trade routes and empires. Instead, their disappearance became a warning etched into the empire's memory. Some horizons are meant to stay beyond reach, yet even in defeat, they left a legacy. Those scattered coins and armor, they're more than relics. They're the first breadcrumbs in one of archaeology's greatest cold cases, proof that exploration's darkest chapters still have stories to tell, if we're willing to listen. Imagine setting sail across an ocean with no land in sight, not for days or weeks, but for months, guided only by the stars above, the swell of waves beneath your canoe, and the flight patterns of birds you've learned to read like a map. This wasn't just a feat of navigation. It was an art form perfected by Polynesian wayfinders centuries before European explorers dared to venture beyond the horizon. These pioneers didn't just stumble upon islands. They orchestrated deliberate crossings over thousands of miles in double-hulled canoes, vessels so stable they could weather the Pacific's fury while carrying entire families, livestock, and the seeds of new civilizations. What's truly astonishing isn't just the distances they cover, it's how they did it without a single compass or written chart. Their tools were living encyclopedias of natural signs passed down through chants and stories. A master navigator could detect subtle shifts in ocean swells, sensing distant land masses long before they appeared on the horizon. They memorized the stars not as static points but as moving guides, understanding how each constellation rose and set at different latitudes. Even the color of the clouds held meaning. A faint greenish tint might hint at a lagoon reflecting sunlight miles away. And then there were the birds, terns and frigate birds whose flight paths at dusk pointed the way home like living compass needles. Modern science is only beginning to grasp the sophistication of these techniques. Researchers studying traditional Polynesian navigation have found that wave patterns, once dismissed as random, actually follow predictable rhythms that can reveal direction and proximity to land. The Wayfinders' ability to read these subtle cues was so precise that their mental maps rival modern GPS in accuracy over vast distances. But perhaps their greatest innovation was ecological intuition, knowing which fish species gathered near reefs, which plants indicated fresh water, even how to transport delicate crops like taro and breadfruit across open ocean to sustain new settlements. Yet the most enduring marvel isn't the technology, it's the human element. These voyages weren't solo exploits but communal acts of trust and memory. Navigators trained for decades, apprenticing under elders who encoded knowledge in intricate oral traditions. A single chant might contain star courses for multiple islands, wave descriptions, and seasonal wind patterns, all preserved without a single written word. When European explorers like Captain Cook marveled at Polynesians' ability to pinpoint distant islands, they were witnessing the culmination of generations of observation, experimentation, and storytelling. What can we learn from these masters of the Pacific? In an age of satellite navigation, their legacy reminds us that true exploration isn't just about reaching a destination, it's about deepening our relationship with the natural world. NASA has even consulted Polynesian navigators to understand how humans might navigate in space where traditional instruments fail. Their story isn't just history, it's a living testament to the power of observation, patience, and the courage to trust knowledge that doesn't fit on a map. The next time you look at the night sky, try seeing it as they did, not as a backdrop, but as a roadmap written in light, waiting to be read. Eudoxus of Cyzicus didn't set out to make history, he just wanted to find a faster route to India. A Greek navigator living in the bustling Egyptian port of Alexandria, he'd heard the whispers centuries earlier. Phoenician sailors had allegedly sailed all the way around Africa. To most, this was just a legend, but to Eudoxus, it was a challenge. Picture him standing on the docks, studying the tides, imagining a world where the endless coastline of Africa wasn't a barrier but a gateway. His first attempt, around 130 BC, was almost absurdly ambitious. With 2 massive ships laden with goods and a crew of seasoned sailors, he set off down the Red Sea, determined to prove the Phoenicians right. What happened next reads like an ancient Greek tragedy. After months at sea, Eudoxus's ships were wrecked on the East African coast, not by storms or monsters, but by something far more mundane: coral reefs. Stranded but undeterred, he and his crew survived by trading with local communities, gathering clues about the coastline's curve. Here's where the story gets fascinating. Somewhere along the way, Eudoxus encountered the remains of a ship unlike any Greek or Egyptian vessel. The locals told him it had washed ashore from the west, its prow carved in a style he recognized from Gadea, modern-day Cadiz in Spain. To Eudoxus, this was electrifying proof. If a ship from the Atlantic could appear on Africa's eastern coast, then the Phoenician tales must be true. The continent could indeed be sailed around. Fueled by this discovery, Eudoxus returned to Alexandria, cobbled together another expedition, and set off again, this time attempting the voyage in reverse, starting from the Atlantic. Ancient sources like Strabo and Posidonios tell us he made it farther than anyone expected, possibly rounding Africa's southern tip before vanishing into the mists of history. His final fate remains a mystery. Some say his crew mutinied, forcing him ashore in Morocco. Others claim he pressed on, only to be lost in the vastness of the Indian Ocean. But his legacy isn't in the miles he covered, it's in the questions he left behind. Why did his breakthroughs fade into obscurity? Partly because Rome's rise shifted Mediterranean priorities, and partly because later scholars dismissed his accounts as exaggerations. Yet modern geographers have pieced together a startling realization. Eudoxus's descriptions of Africa's southern coastline align eerily with reality. His reports of shifting currents and changing star patterns suggest he came closer to circumnavigation than anyone credited him for. The irony is thick. The same man who sought a shortcut to India might have unlocked the continent's true shape centuries before Vasco da Gama, if only anyone had listened. His story isn't just about failure, it's about how history sometimes buries its most visionary explorers, only to rediscover them too late. The Silk Road had its merchants and warriors, but few travelers matched the determination of Xuanzang, a Buddhist monk who turned pilgrimage into the ultimate test of faith and endurance. In the year 629, he slipped out of Cheng, modern-day Xi'an, under cover of night, defying Emperor Taizong's ban on foreign travel. His goal: to reach India, the birthplace of Buddhism, and bring back sacred texts that had been lost or corrupted in China. What awaited him was a journey so grueling it would have broken most mortals. Blistering deserts where mirages taunted thirsty travelers, mountain passes so high they scraped the sky, and bandits who saw lone monks as easy prey. Yet Xuanzang pressed on, driven by something deeper than curiosity, an unshakable belief that truth was worth any sacrifice. His journals read like an ancient survival manual crossed with a spiritual epic. In the Taklamakan Desert, he survived by licking dew off rocks and following the bones of fallen camels as macabre trail markers. Crossing the Pamir Mountains, he clung to icy ledges while winds howled like vengeful spirits. But the physical toll was nothing compared to the intellectual hunger gnawing at him. When he finally reached Nalanda, India's greatest Buddhist university, he didn't just want to copy scriptures. He immersed himself in debates with the era's finest scholars, mastering Sanskrit and philosophy until even his teachers marveled at his insight. The treasures he carried back weren't just material. Alongside 657 Buddhist texts strapped to 22 pack horses, Xuanzang brought home something intangible, a living bridge between cultures. His translations didn't just preserve ancient wisdom, they refined Chinese Buddhism itself, clarifying doctrines that had grown murky over centuries. His descriptions of Indian cities, from the bustling markets of Patalipatra to the serene monasteries of Kashmir, became windows into a world most Chinese could never visit. And his encounters with kings and commoners alike revealed a shared spiritual language that transcended borders. Yet Xuanzang's greatest legacy might be how his journey blurred the line between explorer and pilgrim. Unlike conquerors seeking land or merchants chasing profit, he measured his success in scrolls and sutras, in the quiet moments when a newly translated passage illuminated some eternal truth. Centuries later, his adventures would inspire Journey to the West, the legendary novel featuring the mischievous Monkey King, but the real Xuanzang needed no mythological helpers. His true companions were resilience and an open heart, proving that the most transformative explorations aren't just about crossing distances but bridging worlds within and beyond. The sagas call it Vineland, a place of wild grapes and towering trees, where the sun lingered longer over unfamiliar shores than it ever did in Greenland. Leif Erikson hadn't set out to find a new continent. Like so many discoveries, his was born of a wrong turn. Blown off course during a voyage from Norway to Greenland around the year 1000, he and his crew stumbled upon a coastline so lush it seemed like a gift from the gods. Imagine their shock, Norse sailors raised on tales of icy fjords and barren rocks, standing knee-deep in unfamiliar grasses, their axes sinking into timber so abundant it could rebuild entire fleets. This wasn't just new land, it was a revelation. But Vineland's story isn't about triumph, it's about fragility. The archaeological site at Elance Orks Meadows in modern-day Newfoundland proves the Norse built sod houses and repaired ships there, yet within a decade they were gone. Why the sagas hint at skirmishes with indigenous peoples the Vikings called Skraelings, a term dripping with both fear and fascination. A single arrowhead lodged in a Norse skeleton tells a grim story of conflict. Yet violence alone doesn't explain their retreat. Climate records reveal a chilling twist. The so-called medieval warm period that had made Greenland habitable was already flickering out. As temperatures dropped, ice thickened in the Labrador Sea, turning supply routes treacherous. The very ocean that had brought them to Vineland now barred the way home. What's often overlooked is how close the Norse came to making it work. At Elance Orks Meadows, archaeologists found butternuts, a type of walnut that doesn't grow in Newfoundland, proof the Vikings ventured hundreds of miles south, likely to New Brunswick or Maine. They weren't just visitors, they were probing for a foothold. But without women to establish permanent households, only male artifacts have been found, and lacking the numbers to withstand clashes or crop failures, their dreams of a Western colony crumbled. The sagas frame it as a heroic interlude, but in truth, Vineland was a missed opportunity of staggering proportions. Leif's legacy isn't just about who got to America first. It's a lesson in how discovery alone isn't enough. Survival demands adaptation. The Norse had the ships to cross the Atlantic, but not the flexibility to coexist with unfamiliar ecosystems and cultures. When later European explorers arrived in the 1500s, they found indigenous nations who'd thrived for millennia by mastering their environment. The Vikings, for all their daring, had tried to transplant their way of life rather than learn a new one, and so Vineland faded into myth, a fleeting whisper of what might have been, until a single archaeologist's shovel in the 1960s proved the sagas true all along. Ibn Battuta didn't just travel, he dissolved borders with his footsteps. Setting out from Tangier in 1325, this 21-year-old jurist intended a simple pilgrimage to Mecca. What unfolded instead was a 3-decade odyssey that stretched from the golden markets of Constantinople to the spice-scented ports of Zanzibar, from the snow-capped peaks of Anatolia to the bustling courtyards of Delhi's sultans. By the time he returned home, his sandals had worn thin over 75,000 miles of earth, and his pen had filled volumes with wonders that made Marco Polo's account seem provincial by comparison. What set Ibn Battuta apart wasn't just stamina, it was his role as both observer and participant in the sprawling Dar al-Islam, the interconnected world of medieval Muslim empires. Where Polo marveled as an outsider, Battuta moved as an insider, his fluency in Arabic and training in Islamic law granting him access to royal courts and scholarly circles. In Delhi, he served as a Qadi, dispensing justice under Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq's mercurial rule. In the Maldives, he exasperated locals by insisting women cover themselves, a cultural clash that revealed how even shared faith couldn't erase regional customs. His descriptions of Mamluk Egypt's slave markets or the Black Death's devastation in Syria weren't just travelogues, they were first-hand chronicles of a globalized medieval world. The surprises in his riddler travels still dazzle. He wrote of Chinese junks large enough to carry 600 sailors, their cabins furnished like floating palaces. In Mali, he gaped at Mansa Musa's gold-rich empire, where a single banquet could feed 10,000 and poets held more sway than generals. Yet Battuta wasn't immune to misunderstandings. His account of women rulers in the Maldives dripped with disbelief, and he mistook the Hindu practice of sati for demonic possession. These blind spots remind us that even the most seasoned travelers see through the lens of their own world. So why does his journey eclipse Polo's in scope yet lag in fame? Partly because Polo's ghostwriter, Rustichello, spun their collaboration into a sensational bestseller, while Battuta's memoirs gathered dust until the 19th century. But there's a deeper truth. Polo gave Europeans a tantalizing glimpse of the exotic East, while Battuta documented a Muslim-centric world that Western audiences long ignored. Today, his legacy is being rediscovered not just as a superlative traveler, but as a living bridge between civilizations. His footsteps trace a map of curiosity, proving that the medieval world was far more connected than we imagine. The waves off the coast of Nanjing had never seen anything like it. In 1405, Admiral Zheng He raised his signal flags, and 317 ships, some as long as 400 feet, unfurled their crimson sails. This wasn't just a fleet, it was a floating city carrying 28,000 sailors, diplomats, and scholars across the Indian Ocean. The treasure ships alone could have swallowed Columbus's Santa Maria whole, with decks wide enough for imperial banquets and holds deep enough to carry giraffes back to China as living tribute. For 3 decades, Zheng He's armadas dwarfed anything Europe could muster, reaching as far as Kenya's Swahili coast. Yet within years of his final voyage, these leviathans were rotting in their docks, their charts burned by court officials. How did history's greatest maritime power suddenly turn its back on the sea? Look beyond the ships, and you'll find a story of politics trumping potential. Emperor Yongle, who launched the expeditions, saw them as both diplomacy and theater, proof that the Ming dynasty could command respect without conquest. Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who'd risen through the ranks, was the perfect ambassador. His fleets distributed gold and silk from Java to Zanzibar, not in exchange for territory, but for acknowledgement of China's centrality in the world order. When a Sumatran king dared to withhold tribute, Zheng He didn't burn his ports. He brought him to Nanjing for a stern lecture on etiquette. This wasn't colonialism. It was a celestial bureaucracy extended across the waves. Yet the very extravagance that made the voyages impressive sowed their downfall. Each expedition cost as much as a provincial famine relief effort, funding lacquered decks and porcelain gifts for foreign rulers. When Yongle died, Confucian scholars seized their chance. To them, the ocean represented chaos, a realm of barbarians and storms, while true virtue lay in tending the homeland. They mocked Zheng He's giraffes as Qilin, mythical beasts whose appearance should herald peace, yet somehow required endless fleets to sustain. By 1433, the new emperor had banned ocean-going ships entirely, dismantling the shipyards that had once built giants. The twist, China's retreat, created a vacuum. Within decades, Portuguese caravels were rounding Africa, armed with cannons instead of silks. Zheng He's maps, which might have guided China to global dominance, were lost to fire or hidden away. Historians still debate what might have been. If the Ming had maintained their naval edge, would the age of exploration have been an age of collaboration rather than conquest? The treasure fleets remain history's most tantalizing what if, a reminder that even the grandest visions can founder on the shores of short-sightedness. Their legacy isn't in the ports they reached, but in the boundless horizons they dared to imagine, and the cautionary tale of how quickly horizons can be forgotten. Imagine a world where the finest Islamic scholars worked side by side with Christian rulers to redraw the boundaries of human knowledge. That's exactly what unfolded in 12th century Sicily, where the brilliant Arab geographer Al-Idrisi found himself at the court of King Roger Roman II, a Norman monarch with an insatiable thirst for understanding. This wasn't just a meeting of minds, it was a cultural supernova. Roger commissioned a project so ambitious it would take 15 years to complete, a silver planisphere weighing over 300 pounds, accompanied by a book called The Recreation of Him Who Longs to Traverse the Horizons. Together, they became the most accurate world maps of their time, blending Greek, Islamic, and Viking knowledge into a single breathtaking vision. Al-Idrisi's method was revolutionary. He didn't rely on guesswork or legend. He sent teams of scholars and travelers to verify distances, climates, and trade routes from Spain to the Indus Valley. Picture these investigators fanning out across continents, interviewing merchants about monsoon winds, questioning pilgrims about mountain passes, even noting the peculiarities of local currencies. Back in Palermo, Al-Idrisi cross-referenced their findings with Ptolemy's ancient coordinates and the latest Arabic star charts, creating a synthesis no single culture could have achieved alone. His maps flipped conventional wisdom. Africa didn't taper sharply southward as Europeans believed. It stretched vast and mysterious. Sri Lanka wasn't a speck but a major crossroads of trade. Even the Nile's course was corrected, its sources placed closer to equatorial lakes than to mythical lunar mountains. But the real magic lay in how these maps encoded secrets beyond geography. Scattered among the coastlines and cities were annotations about customs, resources, and even medical remedies. A note near the Caspian Sea mentioned a plant that cured snake bites. The entry for Constantinople detailed the Hagia Sophia's dimensions down to the last cubit. This wasn't just navigation, it was a blueprint for global understanding, where every place had a story. Why did Al-Idrisi's work endure when so many medieval maps faded into obscurity? Because he embraced contradiction. Where others forced the world to fit their theories, he let the world speak for itself. When Viking sagas described icy waters beyond Iceland, he included them alongside Arab accounts of Zanzibar's coral reefs. His maps became the GPS of their day, trusted by Genoese sailors and Cairo scholars alike for 300 years. Even Columbus consulted copies, though he famously ignored their warnings about the Earth's true size. The lesson here isn't just about cartography, it's about what happens when curiosity transcends borders. Roger Roman II could have dismissed Al-Idrisi as an outsider. Al-Idrisi might have scoffed at working for a Christian king. Instead, they built something neither could have created alone, a reminder that the truest map of our world isn't drawn in ink or silver, but in the shared language of discovery. For centuries, the sea route to India was the Mediterranean world's best-kept secret, a maritime shortcut so valuable that merchants would rather brave pirates than share it with rivals. Then came Hippalus, a Greek navigator whose name would become synonymous with one of history's greatest trade revolutions. Picture the scene, a first-century Egyptian harbor, where ships laden with olive oil and glassware crept cautiously along the Arabian coast, hugging shorelines to avoid getting lost in the open ocean. The journey to India's Malabar coast took months, with sailors enduring scorching heat and dwindling supplies. But Hippalus noticed something others had overlooked. The wind itself held the key to a faster passage. The monsoon winds weren't just weather, they were a seasonal clockwork. Every summer, fierce gusts blew steadily from the southwest, perfect for driving ships straight across the Arabian Sea. Come winter, they reversed, offering a guaranteed return trip. Previous captains had feared these winds, believing they'd be swept into oblivion. Hippalus, though, trusted the patterns. His gamble paid off spectacularly. By riding the monsoon, he slashed the voyage from 70 days to just 40, turning what had been a perilous crawl into a direct highway of commerce. Suddenly, spices like pepper and cinnamon, once so rare they were worth their weight in gold, could flood Roman markets in unprecedented quantities. But why had this route remained hidden for so long? The answer lies in the cutthroat economics of ancient trade. Alexandrian merchants guarded their knowledge like state secrets, spreading tales of sea monsters and boiling waters to deter competitors. The Ptolemies of Egypt even stationed warships to intercept unauthorized vessels venturing too far south. Control over the India trade meant control over the luxury cravings of Rome's elite, a monopoly worth killing for. When Hippalus's discovery leaked, it shattered this cartel. Soon, Greek and Roman ships were bypassing Arabian middlemen entirely, docking directly at Indian ports where they traded silver wine cups for sacks of black pepper. The ripple effects transformed empires. Rome's treasury hemorrhaged silver to India, a drain so severe that Emperor Tiberius complained his citizens were paying for Eastern baubles with Western blood. Meanwhile, Indian kingdoms like the Cheras grew fabulously wealthy, their ports buzzing with foreign traders. Even the monsoon winds became characters in this drama. Indian texts called them Hippalus in the Greeks' honor, while Roman geographers marked them on maps as if they were divine highways. Yet the greatest legacy of Hippalus's breakthrough wasn't just faster ships or cheaper spices. It was the birth of globalization's first draft. For the first time, a farmer in Gaul might season his stew with pepper from Kerala, while a Tamil poet could sip wine from Campania. The monsoon route didn't just connect places, it stitched together tastes, ideas, and ambitions across continents. And it all began with one sailor courageous enough to trust the wind. The road to Jerusalem was never meant to be easy, but for Ethiopian pilgrims in the Middle Ages, it was a trial by fire and sand and sea. While European crusaders marched under fluttering banners, these African travelers moved quietly, their journeys etched not in chronicles of conquest but in the quiet persistence of faith. Picture them, dark-skinned monks in rough-spun robes, clutching wooden crosses as they crossed the Nubian desert's scorching wastes or bartered passage on Red Sea dhows crawling with pirates. Their goal wasn't plunder but proximity, to touch the stones Christ had walked upon and bring back fragments of holiness to their mountain-ringed kingdom. What's astonishing isn't just that they made it, it's what they carried home. Ethiopian churches still safeguard treasures that would make any museum weep. Slivers of the true cross encased in golden triptychs, vials of Jordan River water sealed with beeswax, even strands of hair said to belong to the Virgin Mary. These weren't mere souvenirs, they were living connections to the sacred geography of Christianity. In the highlands of Lalibela, where churches were carved downward into solid rock to mimic Jerusalem's topography, pilgrims who couldn't make the arduous journey could still walk the Stations of the Cross through tunnels and grottos designed to echo the holy city's layout. But the real legacy of these pilgrimages lies in the unexpected alliances they forged. When Saladin's armies retook Jerusalem in 1187, European pilgrims were expelled, yet Ethiopian monks were allowed to stay. Their Coptic Christian roots and dark complexions baffled both Muslims and Crusaders, earning them a precarious but precious foothold in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. To this day, a tiny Ethiopian chapel perches on its roof like a swallow's nest, a physical reminder of medieval diplomacy. Back home, returning pilgrims infused Ethiopian Christianity with new rituals. The Lenten fast grew stricter, biblical scholarship deepened, and illuminated manuscripts began blending Middle Eastern motifs with Africa's vibrant colors. The prejudice they faced could fill volumes. Arab traders mocked them as black slaves of Christ, while Venetian sailors overcharged them for passage. Yet every obstacle seemed to steel their resolve. One 15th century account tells of a pilgrim who survived a shipwreck off Yemen, only to be captured and sold into slavery for 10 years. He whispered psalms while tending his master's goats until a ransom from Axum set him free. He walked the last 300 miles to Jerusalem barefoot. Why does this matter now? Because these journeys redefined what it meant to be global Christians long before the word globalization existed. When Ethiopian priests unrolled their parchment maps showing Jerusalem at the center of a world that stretched from the Nile to the Ganges, we're seeing more than geography. We're witnessing the birth of a world view where faith could bridge continents. Their pilgrimages weren't just travels, they were the first threads in a tapestry that still connects Africa to the wider world, one stubborn step at a time. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir stepped onto the shores of Vineland with more than just a traveler's curiosity. She carried the weight of an entire family's hopes. While Leif Erikson's accidental discovery of North America is celebrated, Gudrid's story is where history turns intimate. Imagine the scene, a pregnant Viking woman, far from the turf houses of Greenland, building a home in a land where the very trees stretched taller than any she'd known. The sagas claim she gave birth to a son, Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas, wrapping him in furs as the howls of distant wolves mingled with Norse lullabies. But this wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a radical act of defiance. Exploration narratives rarely center women, yet Gudrid didn't just accompany men, she helped lead them. Her challenges went beyond harsh winters or unfamiliar terrain. Viking society prized women for weaving cloth, not weaving alliances with indigenous peoples. Yet Gudrid's story in the saga of the Greenlanders reveals a woman who negotiated with Skraelings, traded goods, and even hosted feasts to ease tensions. When her husband, Thorfinn Karlsefni, hesitated during a confrontation with native warriors, It was Gudrid who reportedly calmed the situation, using gestures and gifts to de-escalate conflict. These details matter because they shatter the stereotype of Viking women as passive bystanders. Gudrid wasn't just enduring Vineland, she was shaping its fragile peace. Archaeology lends haunting credence to these tales. At Elant's Ox Meadows, the same site where Norsemen repaired ships, excavators found a spindle whorl, a tool used for spinning yarn, unmistakably women's work. This tiny artifact is a silent revolution. It proves Gudrid wasn't alone. Other Norse women crossed the Atlantic, turning Vineland from a seasonal camp into a potential home. Yet the sagas also hint at why their efforts failed. Gudrid's infant son survived, but later Norse expeditions brought no more children. Without families to sink roots, Vineland remained a footnote rather than a colony. What does Gudrid's story teach us about gender and exploration? For centuries, histories framed discovery as a masculine pursuit, conquest, maps, and flags. But Gudrid represents a different truth. Settlement required more than muscle. It demanded the quiet resilience of mothers, the diplomacy of women who could bridge cultures, and the labor of hands that spun wool while men felled trees. Her legacy isn't just in where she went, but in how she redefined what exploration could mean. When she returned to Iceland after Karlsefni's death, she didn't retire to obscurity. The sagas say she became a Christian pilgrim, walking to Rome as boldly as she'd once sailed to Vineland. In a single lifetime, she straddled two worlds, pagan and Christian, old world and new, proving that curiosity has no gender, and that history's greatest journeys often belong to those who build as much as they brave. Ahmad ibn Fadlan never expected to become history's most unlikely Viking chronicler. When the Abbasid Caliph sent him north from Baghdad in 921, his mission was strictly diplomatic, to instruct the Volga Bulgars in Islamic law and assess potential alliances. But the moment his caravan reached the river's edge, he found himself plunged into a world stranger than any traveler's tale. There, amid the birch forests and swirling mists, loomed the Ruse, Viking traders whose longships carried furs, amber, and customs that left even the well-traveled Ibn Fadlan gaping in disbelief. His account reads like an anthropologist's fever dream. Where Arab merchants saw only barbarians, Ibn Fadlan recorded details with relentless precision. He described how the Ruse towered over their Arab counterparts, their bodies tattooed from fingernails to necks with intricate patterns, their mourning rituals involving communal bowls of water where they blew their noses and spat, a habit he noted with horrified fascination. But it was their funeral rites that seared themselves into his memory. A chieftain's burial unfolded over 10 days of brutal spectacle, the sacrifice of horses and dogs, a slave girl who volunteered to join her master in death, and finally, the flaming longship pushed into the Volga's currents, its sails glowing like a second sunset. To Ibn Fadlan, this wasn't just exoticism, it was a mirror reflecting the vast spectrum of human belief. What makes his writings extraordinary isn't just their vividness, but their empathy. While other Muslim travelers dismissed Northern Europeans as filthy giants, Ibn Fadlan passed their logic. When he watched Ruse traders pray to wooden idols for good prices, he didn't scoff, he recognized commerce as a universal language. His description of a merchant testing silver coins by biting them became a metaphor for cultural exchange itself, both sides assessing value through their own lenses. Even his revulsion at their hygiene habits carried a reluctant admiration for their hardiness, noting how they thrived in conditions that would have felled Baghdad's scholars. The irony, this accidental ethnographer nearly vanished from history. His original manuscript was lost for centuries, surviving only in fragments quoted by later geographers. When archaeologists unearthed a Viking chieftain's ship burial in Norway, they found eerie parallels to Ibn Fadlan's descriptions right down to the sacrificed animals and charred remains. Suddenly, this Arab bureaucrat became our most credible witness to Viking customs beyond the sagas. His account even inspired Michael Crichton's The 13th Warrior, though Hollywood took liberties with the facts. Ibn Fadlan's legacy isn't just about Vikings, it's about the power of curiosity to transcend prejudice. Where others saw barriers, he saw bridges. His pen captured a fleeting moment when the Silk Road's southern terminus connected with its northernmost reach, proving that even in an age of divides, there were those who looked past strangeness to find shared humanity. That's why his words still resonate, not as a relic but as a reminder that the greatest explorations aren't measured in miles but in understanding. Mies Titianus moved through the markets of the Hexi corridor like a ghost, his plain tunic hiding the sharp eyes of Rome's most unlikely spy. Officially, he was just another merchant trailing the Silk Road's caravans. But in the year 66, with Emperor Nero's paranoia at its peak, every scrap of intelligence from the East mattered. Gold wasn't the only currency on this journey. Information was the real treasure. His mission to reach the fabled Stone Tower, a trading post rumored to mark the edge of the known world where Chinese silk changed hands through chains of middlemen. No Roman had gone that far and returned to tell the tale until Mies. The political stakes couldn't have been higher. While Nero fiddled with poetry plots in Rome, Parthian agents lurked along the trade routes, choking Rome's access to Eastern luxuries. The Parthians' new silk wasn't just a fashion statement, it was power. Senators draped in Chinese silks signaled Rome's reach, but the supply depended on fickle intermediaries. Mies's reports, preserved in fragments by later geographers like Ptolemy, reveal a world of delicate brinkmanship. He noted how Kushan horsemen controlled key mountain passes, how Sogdian merchants exaggerated dangers to hike prices, and most crucially, how the Han Dynasty's envoys had never ventured west of the Pamirs. Here was Rome's opportunity. If they could bypass the Parthians and strike direct deals, they'd rewrite the balance of power. Yet the true intrigue lies in what Mies didn't find. Expecting a monolithic Chinese empire, he instead documented a patchwork of city-states and nomadic tribes, none claiming direct contact with the Han capital. His Stone Tower wasn't some grand imperial outpost but a modest trading hub where languages collided and goods were bartered in makeshift pigeons. For Nero's advisors, this was revelatory. China wasn't a centralized monolith to be intimidated, it was a distant, disinterested giant. The realization forced a strategic pivot. Rome couldn't bully its way to silk, it had to work the middlemen. Mies's legacy isn't just in the miles he covered, it's in the shadows he exposed. When his accounts reached Rome, they didn't spark the military campaigns some expected. Instead, they fueled a quieter revolution, the rise of specialized diplomatic corps. Future envoys would mimic his methods, blending commerce with espionage. And that Stone Tower he sought. Modern scholars place it near modern-day Tashkent in Xinjiang, a windswept junction where a Roman's footprints briefly altered history's map. His journey proved that sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't lands or treasures, but the fragile webs of connection and deception that bind them. The Maya didn't just build temples, they built an economic empire on the backs of merchant adventurers who paddled into the unknown with nothing but dugout canoes and sheer nerve. Picture this: under a blistering sun, a flotilla of 30-foot mahogany canoes slices through the Gulf of Mexico's turquoise waters, each vessel laden with sacks of cacao beans so precious they doubled as currency. These weren't casual traders, they were the Amazon delivery drivers of the ancient Americas, threading through shark-infested waters and hurricane seasons to connect city-states from Tikal to Teotihuacan. While Eurasia had its Silk Road, the Maya had something equally extraordinary, a maritime and jungle-tangled web of commerce where jade moved like Bitcoin and obsidian blades cut sharper than any contract. What made their trade network so revolutionary? Scale alone didn't define it. It was the sophistication. Maya merchants didn't just haul goods, they hauled ideas. A potter in Capon might etch glyphs inspired by designs from Palenque, while a noble in Calakmul sipped chocolate infused with vanilla from Veracruz. Archaeologists have traced jade from Guatemala's Motagua Valley to as far north as New Mexico, and cacao, the lifeblood of Maya economy, appeared in places where the climate couldn't possibly support its growth. This wasn't random barter. It was a meticulously orchestrated system of ports, middlemen, and even standardized weights. Coastal hubs like Cerros served as ancient Walmart supercenters, where salt from the Yucatan's flats met Quetzal feathers from cloud forests, all under the watchful eyes of merchant guilds who recorded deals in bark paper ledgers. But let's not romanticize the grind. Every canoe that left port flirted with disaster. Pirates lurked in mangrove swamps, ready to ambush slow-moving vessels. Storms could swallow whole fleets without a trace. Spanish accounts later described finding Maya canoes capsized with their crew's skeletons still tangled in the rigging. And then there were the politics. A merchant carrying obsidian, the razor-sharp volcanic glass used for tools and weapons, might be welcomed in one city and executed as a spy in another. The Maya world was a patchwork of warring states where trade routes doubled as intelligence pipelines. One surviving mural even shows a merchant disguised as a noble, hinting at the cloak and dagger games played to move goods across hostile borders. Yet the real genius lay in what they traded beyond objects. The Maya spread more than cacao and jade. They swapped calendars, eclipse predictions, and even medical knowledge. A healer in Tikal might prescribe a remedy scribbled on a codex that originated 500 miles away. Their glyphic writing system, the most advanced in the pre-Columbian Americas, flowed along these same routes, binding distant cities into a shared intellectual universe. When Spanish friars later burned thousands of Maya books, they weren't just destroying literature, they were erasing the receipts of a continent-spanning conversation. So how does this stack up against Eurasia's Silk Road? In sheer mileage, the Maya networks were smaller, but in cultural impact, they punched way above their weight. Where the Silk Road had camels, the Maya had canoes. Where China had silk, they had chocolate, a commodity so coveted that counterfeiting it with clay-filled cacao pods became a capital offense. And while Eurasian traders relied on centralized empires for protection, Maya merchants often operated in the cracks between warring kingdoms, their survival depending on wit and diplomacy. Their legacy isn't just in the artifacts they moved, but in proving that globalization isn't a modern invention. It's a human instinct, as old as the first time someone paddled a canoe past the horizon, wondering what they might barter on the other side. Ahmad ibn Majid's quill scratched across the parchment by lantern light, translating centuries of Arab sailing wisdom into verse. To the untrained eye, his words might have seemed like mere poetry, odes to monsoons and star clusters, but for those who could decipher them, they were lifelines. Born in 1521 in the bustling port of Julfar, near modern-day Ras Al Khaimah, Ibn Majid wasn't just a navigator, he was a living library of the Indian Ocean's secrets. His family had piloted ships for generations, and by the time he took up the pen, he'd memorized every current from Mozambique to Malacca. But history would remember him for an irony as vast as the seas he charted. His expertise became the key that unlocked India for Europe's most ambitious invader, Vasco da Gama. The encounter between Ibn Majid and da Gama off the East African coast in 1498 reads like a geopolitical thriller. The Portuguese, having battled their way around the Cape of Good Hope, were stranded. Their ships battered, their crews riddled with scurvy, their maps useless beyond Africa's eastern shores. Local Swahili sailors, wary of these armed outsiders, refused to guide them. Then came Ibn Majid, lured aboard Da Gama's flagship under ambiguous circumstances. Some accounts suggest he was tricked into believing the Portuguese were Muslim allies. Others claim he saw an opportunity to showcase Arab superiority. Whatever the motive, his guidance was devastatingly effective. Within weeks, Da Gama's fleet rode the monsoon winds straight to Calicut, smashing the Arab-Venetian monopoly on the spice trade. But why would a master navigator hand his rivals the playbook? The answer lies in Ibn Majid's own writings. His Kitab al-Fawaid, a maritime encyclopedia written in rhythmic verse, wasn't just about navigation, it was a cultural manifesto. He believed the ocean belonged to those who respected its laws, regardless of faith or flag. The Portuguese, with their crude charts and brute force, offended his professional pride. By showing them the right way to sail, he may have hoped to demonstrate Arab mastery, never imagining they'd use it to dismantle the very world he cherished. His poems even hint at this tension, praising the ocean as a shared inheritance while lamenting the fools who sail without wisdom. The real marvel, though, lies in the techniques Ibn Majid revealed. His verses encoded star altitudes for latitude calculations, described the magnetic properties of lodestones centuries before Europe's compasses, and detailed monsoon patterns with near meteorological precision. He even documented the whistling winds of the Somali jet, a weather phenomenon modern scientists only confirmed with satellites. These weren't just directions, they were symphonies of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations of sailors who'd learned to read the ocean's moods like a familiar face. Yet Ibn Majid's legacy is bittersweet. The trade routes he helped perfect became highways for colonial conquest, and his name faded in the Arab world as Portuguese cannons boomed over Indian harbors. Only in the 20th century did historians rediscover his manuscripts, realizing they'd been the Rosetta Stone of Indian Ocean navigation all along. Today, his ghost lingers in the Dhow captains who still chant his star poems under the same skies he once mapped. His story isn't just about one man's misplaced trust, it's a reminder that knowledge, no matter how carefully guarded, has a way of slipping its chains and sailing into unexpected hands. The sea, as Ibn Majid himself wrote, tells no lies, but it keeps its secrets until the worthy come asking, and sometimes the worthy wear the wrong colors. The storm tore through the ship's rigging like a wild beast, snapping masts and shredding sails until the vessel was little more than a splintered husk adrift in the North Pacific. When the surviving crew of the Shinsho Maru finally staggered ashore in 1782, they found themselves not on familiar Japanese soil, but in the frozen wastes of Siberia's Aleutian Islands, a world away from everything they knew. These were no explorers seeking new horizons. They were fishermen, merchants, and a lone samurai caught in a twist of fate that would crack open Japan's centuries-old isolation like an eggshell. What followed was a diplomatic ballet unlike any other. Russia, under Empress Catherine the Great, saw an opportunity. Japan had been sealed tighter than a lacquer box since the 1630s, banning foreigners under penalty of death and permitting only a trickle of Dutch trade at Nagasaki. Now here was a chance to pry open dialogue. If only they could bridge the chasm of language. The castaways spoke no Russian, their rescuers knew no Japanese. Communication unfolded in pantomime and pidgin, with scribbled Chinese characters serving as a fragile bridge. Both nations' elites read classical Chinese. The Russians treated the survivors with surprising courtesy. housing them in Irkutsk for years while officials debated how to leverage this accident into trade negotiations. The castaways' ordeal peeled back the curtain on Japan's Sakoku policy in startling ways. Stranded far from home, they witnessed Russia's imperial ambitions firsthand, the fortresses creeping eastward, the maps charting Kamchatka and beyond. When they were finally repatriated via a painstaking overland route, their debriefings sent shockwaves through Edo. The shogunate spies grilled them for months, compiling a secret dossier titled Tales of the Drifting Ship. Their accounts described Russian hospitals treating commoners with respect, libraries filled with books in dozens of languages, and a navy bristling with cannons. For a regime built on controlling information, this was dynamite. Yet the real revelation lay in the cultural collisions. The samurai of the group, Kodaiu, adapted with startling pragmatism. He learned to toast with vodka, wore a bearskin coat against the cold, and even met Catherine herself kneeling in Caesar on a Persian carpet while she peppered him with questions about Japanese customs. His survival hinged on flexibility, a trait Japan's rigid hierarchy rarely rewarded. Meanwhile, Russian naturalists seized the chance to document everything from the castaways' chopstick techniques to their bafflement at seeing women dine alongside men. The shogunate's response, a masterclass in controlled panic. They welcomed the survivors home, then immediately imprisoned them. Kodaiu spent years under house arrest, his knowledge too dangerous to ignore but too subversive to share. The government scrubbed Russian place names from his reports, terrified ordinary citizens might glimpse a world beyond the shogun's grip. When a Russian envoy finally reached Nagasaki in 1804, bearing the castaways' old belongings as a goodwill gesture, Japan's reply was a resounding no: no trade, no diplomacy, no further contact. This collision of frost and fanaticism holds up a mirror to how isolationism crumbles. The Shinsho Maru incident proved no policy could hold back the tide forever. Within decades, American warships would force Japan's doors open, but the first crack appeared that day in Siberia, not from cannon fire, but from the bewildered gaze of fishermen who'd seen too much. Their story isn't just about survival, it's about the moments when history pivots on something as fragile as a drifting ship, and the people who realize too late they've become pawns in a much larger game. Gold dust swirled through the streets of Cairo like a desert sandstorm, but this wasn't nature's doing, it was the aftermath of Mansa Musa's generosity. When the Malian emperor embarked on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he didn't just travel as a devout Muslim, he moved as a walking economic earthquake. His caravan stretched across the horizon, 60,000 men, 12,000 slaves, and 100 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of pure gold. To grasp the scale, imagine a single ounce of gold today multiplied by millions, all flowing from the mines of West Africa into the heart of the medieval world. The moment his entourage entered Cairo, the local economy shuddered. Mansa Musa distributed gold with such abandon that its value plummeted overnight. Egyptian merchants scrambled to adjust prices while goldsmiths gaped at the sudden surplus. A single anecdote captures the chaos. When a courtier tried to return an overpayment, the emperor waved him off, declaring, "I never take back what I give." For decades after, Cairo's markets reeled from the inflation caused by this golden tsunami. Yet the real surprise wasn't the wealth itself, it was its source. Medieval Europe had dismissed Africa as a continent of savages, but here was a king whose treasury seemed inexhaustible, his empire fueled by salt mines and gold deposits that dwarfed anything in Christendom. Myths sprouted like desert flowers after rain. Some claimed Mansa Musa built a new mosque every Friday of his journey. Others whispered he paved roads with gold bricks. The most enduring legend tells of his stop in Medina, where he repaid a modest loan with a staggering 50,000-ounce bonus, an act so lavish the creditor fainted. These stories weren't just exaggerations, they were propaganda. By design, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage announced Mali's arrival on the global stage. His gold bought more than goodwill. It purchased prestige, securing alliances with sultans and scholars who'd never before glanced toward Timbuktu. But beneath the glitter lay shrewd strategy, that reckless generosity. It was calculated diplomacy. By flooding Cairo with gold, Mansa Musa ensured Mali dominated trade routes for years. When he returned home, he brought something far more valuable than souvenirs: architects from Andalusia to design the Great Mosque of Timbuktu, and scholars to transform his capital into a beacon of Islamic learning. The gold would eventually be spent, but the cultural capital endured. Centuries later, when European mapmakers drew the Land of Gold, they placed Mansa Musa at its center, throne in hand, a golden orb weighing down the parchment like an anchor. His pilgrimage didn't just alter economies, it redrew the mental map of a continent, proving Africa's wealth wasn't just in its soil, but in the vision of those who knew how to wield it. The wind howled through the Hindu Kush like a chorus of ghosts, biting at the exposed skin of Alexander the Great's soldiers as they trudged upward into the clouds. These were men who had crossed deserts and stormed fortresses, but the mountains tested them in ways no enemy could. At altitudes where the air grew thin and fires refused to burn, they began reporting shadows lurking in the snow, massive, shaggy figures that vanished into the blizzards. To the Macedonians, raised on tales of monsters at the world's edges, there was only one explanation: they'd stumbled upon the realm of Yetis. What's fascinating isn't just that these hardened warriors believed in snow monsters, it's how their accounts align with modern zoology. The Yetis they described, with their hunched postures and thunderous footfalls, were likely Asiatic brown bears or even the now rare Himalayan lynx, magnified by fear and altitude sickness. Ancient writers like Plutarch and Arrian preserved these sightings with a mix of skepticism and awe, noting how the creatures seemed to vanish like phantoms into the rock. But the real story here isn't about cryptids, it's about how mountains humbled history's most formidable army. Alexander's campaign had bulldozed through Persian palaces and Indian war elephants, but the Hindu Kush became his silent nemesis. Supply lines snapped like twigs in the thin air, frostbite turned seasoned soldiers into invalids. Even the war horses, bred for the plains of Macedonia, floundered in knee-deep snow. The locals, wise to the terrain, watched with grim amusement as the invaders hacked at ice with swords, trying to carve paths where none existed. For the first time, geography itself had outmaneuvered the conqueror who'd outmaneuvered emperors. Yet the mountain's greatest trick was psychological. Ancient armies drew strength from cohesion, the crash of shields, the rhythm of marching feet. But in the passes, men straggled alone, swallowed by fog or buried under avalanches without a trace. The Greeks began seeing omens in every crevasse, interpreting the groans of shifting glaciers as the voices of angry gods. By the time they descended into India, the legend of the Yeti had become a metaphor for the uncanny dread of the unknown. What can we learn from this collision of conquest and altitude? Modern climbers have a term for it: summit fever, the dangerous obsession to push forward despite escalating risks. Alexander's men, far from home and desperate for glory, embodied this millennia before Everest. Their Yeti stories weren't just campfire tales. They were coping mechanisms for an environment so alien it demanded supernatural explanations. Today, we know the real monsters were hypothermia and hypoxia, but the mystery endures. When later explorers like Marco Polo recounted similar sightings, they were unknowingly walking in the footsteps of those first terrified Greeks, proving that some frontiers resist domination, no matter how great the army or the general who dares to cross them. Ban Zhao dipped her brush into ink with the same precision she applied to navigating the treacherous politics of the Han Dynasty court. As the first female historian of China, she was already an anomaly, a woman whose scholarship commanded respect in an era when most of her gender were barred from formal education. But her most enduring legacy wasn't just recording history. It was guiding those who dared to make it one dusty mile of the Silk Road at a time. Her lessons for women might sound like a domestic manual, but woven between the lines were survival strategies for a far more dangerous journey, the intricate dance of cross-cultural trade. Picture a merchant setting out from Cheng, his camels laden with silk. The physical dangers, bandits, sandstorms, thirst were obvious, but Ban Zhao understood the subtler perils. Her writings advised travelers to memorize the body language of border officials, noting how a slight tilt of the head could signal bribery demands. She catalogued which gifts would flatter Parthian nobles' exquisite lacquerware, and which would insult them white flowers, a color of mourning. For female merchants, yes, they existed. Though history often erases them, she coded advice on blending in, wearing loose Sogdian robes to hide pregnancies, or carrying needles to barter for safe passage with nomadic women skilled in wound stitching. What set her apart wasn't just the content, it was the lens through which she viewed the Silk Road. Male geographers of her era focused on distances and tariffs. Ban Zhao documented where to find wet nurses after miscarriages in cotton, which caravanserais had clean birthing rooms, and how to soothe a colicky baby with fermented mare's milk, knowledge born from listening to the whispers of merchant wives in palace courtyards. Her maps included more than cities. They marked the locations of sympathetic midwives, and which oasis wells were safest for menstruating women to drink from without inviting suspicion. The backlash was inevitable. Confucian scholars dismissed her work as women's trifles, little realizing how many of their own diplomats relied on her scrolls. A surviving fragment from a Tang Dynasty border post reveals a telling detail. Ban Zhao's guides were often copied onto thin silk and sewn into the linings of official robes, hidden but indispensable. Even the famed monk Xuanzang, centuries later, admitted in his journals that he'd carried a smuggled excerpt describing how to deflect amorous advances from Kushan warlords by quoting Buddhist sutras at them. Her true innovation, recognizing that the Silk Road wasn't just a highway for goods, it was a nerve center of human connection. Where others saw commerce, she saw the unspoken rules that made it possible, the way a shared cup of tea could dissolve tensions, or how offering to fix a broken axle might earn a Scythian chieftain's protection. Modern archaeologists have found her influence in unlikely places. A scrap of her advice on negotiating with Tibetan traders was recovered from a Roman-era trash heap in Palmyra, proof that her wisdom traveled farther than she ever did. Ban Zhao's legacy crumbles the myth that women were passive observers of ancient exploration. Her writings reveal a shadow network of female knowledge, passed hand to hand like contraband. The Silk Road's grandeur was built not just on the backs of camels, but on the quiet intelligence of women who understood that survival depended as much on cultural fluency as on sturdy sandals. Her maps didn't just chart landscapes, they mapped the delicate art of staying alive and human in a world that prized silk but often forgot the hands that wove it. Al-Yaqubi gripped his reed pen tighter as his boat rocked against the Nile's currents, the papyrus before him smudged with hastily scribbled notes. It was the 9th century, and while Baghdad scholars debated ancient Greek texts, this Arab geographer was doing something radical. He was testing their theories against the reality of the river itself. Previous maps, relying on Ptolemy's centuries-old accounts, showed the Nile originating from mythical mountains of the moon somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. But as Al-Yaqubi pressed further south than any recorded traveler before him, he found no towering peaks, just an endless labyrinth of swamps and tributaries that defied simple explanation. The challenges he faced weren't just geographical, they were intellectual. Greek and Roman authorities had treated the Nile's source as a philosophical abstraction rather than a physical place. Some claimed it sprang from underground caverns, others insisted it was meltwater from snow-capped mountains, a laughable idea to anyone who'd felt the Sahara's heat. Local guides, wary of sharing knowledge with outsiders, fed Al-Yaqubi deliberate misinformation pointing to random confluences as the true source to protect sacred sites. Yet he persisted, cross-referencing merchant accounts with his own observations of seasonal floods, noting how the river's color changed from blue to green as he neared the Sud, a vast wetland in modern South Sudan. His breakthrough came not from conquering nature, but from listening to it. While classical scholars had imagined the Nile as a single mighty vein, Al-Yaqubi documented it as a living network, fed by countless smaller rivers like the Bahr el Ghazal and the Sobat, each with its own rhythms. His meticulous records debunked the Mountains of the Moon legend entirely, proving the Nile's waters gathered gradually from rainfall and marshes rather than bursting forth from some dramatic singularity. To a world raised on Herodotus' tales of crocodiles and pygmies, this was heresy wrapped in hydrology. The backlash was swift. Baghdad's establishment dismissed his work as the ramblings of a man who'd gone too far into the sweltering south. But time vindicated him. Centuries later, when European explorers like Burton and Speke discovered Lake Victoria, they were unwittingly following the trail Al-Yaqubi had blazed, right down to his warnings about the Sud's impassable papyrus thickets. His real legacy wasn't just in correcting maps, it was in demonstrating that rivers, like truths, are rarely simple. They meander, they converge, and sometimes they demand we wade into the unknown to understand where they and we truly begin. The silence in Greenland's fjords is deceptive. Where Viking longhouses once stood, only crumbling stone foundations remain, their outlines barely visible beneath centuries of moss and frost. These weren't fleeting outposts, they were thriving settlements that lasted nearly 500 years with churches, dairy farms, and even a bishopric. Yet by the mid-15th century, every Norse settler had vanished, leaving behind tools half-carved, hearths cold, and a mystery that still taunts historians. How could a people so resilient simply disappear? The easy answer points to the Little Ice Age, that slow creep of glaciers that began strangling Greenland's pastures in the 13th century. Pollen samples tell a grim story. The hardy grasses the Norse relied on for grazing their cattle gave way to stubborn lichens as temperatures plummeted. But climate alone doesn't explain why the Inuit neighbors thrived while the Norse faltered. Dig through middens those ancient garbage heaps, and the contrast is striking. Inuit layers burst with seal bones and walrus ivory, evidence of a diet adapted to the changing seas. The Norse refuse pits filled with the bones of their prized cattle, a stubborn commitment to a dying way of life. Archaeologists have uncovered darker clues beneath the permafrost. At the settlement of Gardar, a dog's skeleton was found with cut marks, suggesting it was butchered in desperation. In another farmstead, a lone skeleton lay face down in the doorway, as if collapsing mid-flight. These aren't just signs of hardship, they're snapshots of a society unraveling. The Norse didn't just starve, they fractured. Trade records from Bergen show that ivory shipments, their lifeline to Europe, dwindled as walrus populations were hunted to local extinction. Without these luxuries to barter for iron and timber, Greenland's settlers became prisoners of their own isolation. Yet the most haunting evidence isn't in the bones or the soil, it's in the choices they refused to make. Inuit oral histories speak of tentative contact, Norse traders bartering milk for seal meat, but never learning to kayak or hunt on the ice. Their church records reveal a chilling preoccupation excommunicating settlers who dared wear Inuit-style clothing, as if cultural purity mattered more than survival. In the end, their greatest weakness wasn't the cold, it was the inability to adapt. The Greenland settlements didn't collapse overnight. They faded, farm by abandoned farm, as families boarded ships bound for Iceland or simply walked into blizzards rather than change. Their story isn't just a climate cautionary tale, it's a warning about the price of inflexibility. When the last ship sailed away in the 1440s, it left behind a question written in stone and ice. What good is resilience if it can't bend? The ship carrying Sundo cut through the morning, mist like a blade through silk, its hull laden not with goods but with something far more precious: sutras wrapped in oilcloth, a sandalwood Buddha statue, and the weight of a mission that would reshape a peninsula. When this Chinese monk stepped onto Korean shores in the year 372, he wasn't just crossing water, he was bridging worlds. The kingdom of Goguryeo, then locked in fierce rivalry with neighboring Beach and Silla, saw religion through a warrior's lens, not as philosophy but as power. King Sojerim, a ruler desperate to consolidate his fractious nobles, recognized in Buddhism something revolutionary, a spiritual framework that could unify his people beyond clan loyalties. Sundo's arrival sparked a cultural alchemy. Local shamans who'd long served as intermediaries between heaven and earth watched warily as monks chanted in unfamiliar tongues. But the court astrologers noticed something uncanny: the dates of Buddhist ceremonies aligned eerily with celestial events their own traditions had marked for centuries. This wasn't mere coincidence, it was strategic genius. Sundo had studied Goguryeo existing cosmology, framing Buddhism not as a replacement but as the missing piece of a puzzle the kingdom already knew. When he presented the Buddha's teachings as compatible with local mountain worship, even identifying sacred peaks as earthly manifestations of Bodhisattva's resistance melted like spring snow. The transformations came swiftly but not violently. Unlike later religious expansions marked by forced conversions, Korea's Buddhist dawn was a dialogue. At the royal capital of Pyongyang, artisans began blending Chinese pagoda designs with native woodworking techniques, creating tiered temples that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. The sarira reliquaries used to enshrine the ashes of revered monks mimicked the shape of ancient Korean bronze ritual vessels, a silent homage to ancestors. Even the language adapted. The Chinese term Bul for Buddha softened into the Korean Bul, while native words like Hanul, heaven, were woven seamlessly into sutras. Yet the true test came not in palaces but in villages. Sundo's successors, monks like Adu and Malananda, took Buddhism's most radical idea, that enlightenment was possible for all, and made it tangible. They established monasteries near communal springs where farmers already gathered, offering medical care alongside meditation. When drought struck, it wasn't the shamans alone who prayed for rain. Buddhist monks stood beside them, chanting while sprinkling water blessed in both traditions. This pragmatism turned potential conflict into collaboration. Within 2 generations, Buddhist temples doubled as granaries during famines, their bell towers repurposed as watchtowers against bandits. The ripple effects reached far beyond religion. King Sojerim's successors used Buddhist networks to establish Korea's first state-sponsored schools, where sons of nobles and commoners alike studied Chinese classics alongside Dharma teachings. The Tripitaka Korina, that monumental collection of Buddhist scriptures carved onto 81,000 wooden blocks, would later become a beacon of scholarship, but its roots lay in these early exchanges. Even Korea's famed Celadon pottery owes a debt to monastic kilns, where monks experimented with glazed techniques to craft ritual vessels. What Sundo began wasn't just the spread of a faith, it was the birth of a cultural hybridity that would define Korea for millennia. The miracle wasn't that Buddhism took root, but how it grew into something uniquely Korean, neither foreign import nor carbon copy, but a living tradition that honored its origins while putting down new roots. When modern visitors hike to secluded temples like Bulguksa, they're walking paths laid centuries ago by a monk who understood that the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the spaces between what we bring and what we're willing to receive. Herodotus's claim sounds like something ripped from an ancient mariner's tall tale. A fleet of Phoenician ships commissioned by Egypt's pharaoh Necho Roman II setting sail from the Red Sea, venturing southward until they somehow circled the entire African continent and returned through the Pillars of Hercules 3 years later. To the Greeks who heard it, the story seemed ludicrous. The idea that anyone could survive the equatorial heat, let alone navigate the uncharted waters beyond the known world, defied belief. Yet tucked between Herodotus's skepticism lies a startling detail. The sailors reported that at some point in their journey, the sun passed to their right north of them as they sailed westward. To modern ears, that's the smoking gun. Only someone who'd crossed the southern hemisphere could describe such a phenomenon, so how did they pull it off? Phoenician ships were technological marvels of their era, sleek, cedar-hulled vessels with crescent-shaped sails designed to harness the wind with uncanny efficiency. Their keels cut through waves rather than riding atop them, allowing them to venture farther into open ocean than bulkier Greek or Egyptian ships dared. But hardware alone didn't make this voyage possible. The Phoenicians were masters of celestial navigation, using the North Star to hold their course at night. During the day, they read ocean swells like road maps, detecting subtle shifts that hinted at distant landmasses. Their greatest advantage, though, was patience. Unlike later European explorers who raced against time and scurvy, the Phoenicians embraced the rhythm of the coasts. Ancient records suggest they beached their ships annually, not just to repair hulls or replenish supplies, but to sow crops and wait out unfavorable winds. A 3-year voyage wasn't a non-stop ordeal. It was a series of calculated pauses, each stopover turning strangers into trading partners who might offer critical intelligence about the waters ahead. The logistical hurdles were staggering. Freshwater alone would have required meticulous planning. Each ship likely carried clay storage jars holding thousands of gallons, supplemented by rainwater collection during monsoon seasons. Food presented another puzzle. Mediterranean diets relied on wheat and olives, but these wouldn't survive tropical humidity. Archaeologists studying Phoenician colonies in Spain and Morocco have found evidence of their adaptability. Sun-dried fish packed in salt, jars of fermented grape paste rich in vitamin C, and even portable clay ovens for baking flatbreads on deck. Then there were the psychological terrors. The Cape of Good Hope, with its tempestuous waves and howling winds, wasn't charted until millennia later by Portuguese sailors, yet the Phoenicians would have faced these same waters without any forewarning. Imagine their shock when familiar constellations dipped below the horizon, replaced by strange southern stars. Critics loved to point out the lack of physical evidence, no shipwrecks, no inscriptions definitively proving the journey. But absence of proof isn't proof of absence. The Phoenicians were notorious secret keepers, guarding trade routes as fiercely as modern corporations protect patents. Their scribes wrote on papyrus which crumbles to dust in all but the driest climates. Even Herodotus admits they shared minimal details, leaving us to piece together the puzzle from oblique clues. Later circumnavigators like Vasco da Gama suffered horrific losses. Half his crew perished. If the Phoenicians succeeded, their survival rate would have been nothing short of miraculous. The real question isn't whether they could have done it, it's why they didn't colonize Africa if they did. The answer may lie in economics. Phoenician voyages were funded by kings and temples, not curiosity. Necho-Roman too likely sought a naval shortcut to bypass Arabian middlemen monopolizing Red Sea trade. When his dynasty fell, the incentive to repeat the grueling journey vanished. Later Greek and Roman geographers, inheriting fragments of the story, dismissed it as fantasy, not realizing their skepticism said more about their own limitations than Phoenician capabilities. Today, as oceanographers retrace ancient currents and archaeologists unearth Phoenician anchors off Mozambique's coast, Herodotus's tale feels less like myth and more like a challenge to stop underestimating the sailors who first taught the Mediterranean how to dream beyond the horizon. Their legacy isn't just in miles traveled, but in the audacity to trust the sea long before maps existed to make it safe. Priscus of Panium stepped into Attila's camp with the cautious gait of a man walking on ice. The year was 449, and the Byzantine diplomat found himself in a world that defied every expectation. Around him, the Hun Empire sprawled not in marble palaces but in a sea of felt tents, their horsehide walls trembling in the wind. The air smelled of smoke and fermented mare's milk, a far cry from the incense-filled halls of Constantinople. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission. It was a collision of civilizations where the rules of engagement had yet to be written. What made Priscus's account so extraordinary wasn't just the spectacle of Attila's court, it was the mechanics of communication itself. The Huns had no written language, no formal bureaucracy, yet their empire stretched from the Caspian to the Rhine. Priscus, a Greek-speaking Roman, relied on a chain of interpreters, first to Latin, then to Gothic, and finally to the guttural Hunnic tongue. Each translation was like passing a message through a series of distorting mirrors, where every nuance risked being lost or weaponized. At one tense banquet, Attila's scribe, a captured Roman, leaned in to whisper corrections when the Hunnic boasts grew too inflammatory. Diplomacy here wasn't about scrolls and seals, it was about reading the flicker in a warlord's eyes as he weighed your words. The contrasts were jarring. Priscus noted how Attila, clad in plain wool while his subordinates glittered in gold, dismissed Byzantine silks as pretty cobwebs. Yet for all his scorn, the Hun leader grasped the power of spectacle. When Priscus presented gifts, dates from Mesopotamia, spiced wines from Syria, Attila staged a calculated display of indifference, only to later interrogate him about Constantinople's fortifications over cups of kumis, the sour fermented drink that made the diplomat's stomach churn. Every gesture was a test. The Huns' famous hospitality feasts where guests were expected to drain massive drinking horns was as much about assessing resolve as sharing goodwill. But beneath the machismo lay surprising sophistication. Priscus witnessed disputes settled not by whim, but through councils where even low-ranking warriors could speak. The Huns' laws were oral traditions, memorized and recited like epic poems, with penalties ranging from fines paid in horses to banishment into the steppes' endless grass. When a Byzantine envoy drunkenly insulted Attila, the punishment wasn't execution, it was forcing the offender to negotiate while hungover, his pounding head a living lesson in humility. The real revelation in Priscus's writings isn't just how the Huns governed, but how they absorbed. Attila's court swarmed with renegade Romans, Gothic turncoats, and Persian defectors, each adding strands to the empire's political DNA. The warlord who terrified Rome was in private a collector of talent. His scribe Orsts, a Roman, would father the last Western emperor. Priscus himself nearly became part of this human mosaic when a former Roman citizen, now living contentedly among the Huns, tried to convince him to abandon Byzantium's decadence for the steppe's stark freedoms. Why does this encounter still resonate? Because it shatters the myth of the barbarian horde. Priscus's account shows us a world where diplomacy wasn't about shared customs, but shared interests where power could be negotiated across language barriers as wide as the Danube. When Attila finally dismissed the Byzantines with a warning instead of swords, it wasn't mercy, it was calculus. He needed Roman gold to pay his coalition, just as Rome needed his armies distracted from its borders. Their understanding wasn't inscribed on parchment, but etched in the unspoken grammar of mutual need. The lesson for modern ears is stark. Communication isn't about speaking the same language, but recognizing the same stakes. Priscus's journey reminds us that the most delicate negotiations often happen not in courtrooms, but in the spaces between words, in the shared silence of two powers measuring what they're willing to lose. To understand the power of songlines, imagine standing in the red dust of Australia's outback with no compass, no GPS, just the words of an ancient melody humming in your mind. Each verse corresponds to a landmark, a twisted gum tree, a weathered rock formation, a dry riverbed that floods seasonally. For Aboriginal peoples, these aren't just directions, they're a living atlas, passed down through generations in rhythms that map the land as precisely as any satellite image. A single song might stretch hundreds of miles, its verses acting as both roadmap and cultural archive, encoding not just where to go but how to interact with every spring, sacred site, and seasonal food source along the way. What baffled early European explorers was the accuracy of these oral maps. Without written words or drawn coordinates, Aboriginal guides could traverse deserts with unerring precision, their songs detailing water holes invisible to outsiders. The secret lay in multisensory wayfinding. A songline doesn't just describe a place, it evokes its sounds, smells, and even tactile sensations. The crunch of pebbles underfoot, the scent of rain-soaked acacia, the way sunlight hits a cliff face at dawn, all become navigational cues. Western cartography reduces landscapes to abstract lines and symbols, but songlines insist that to know a place, you must feel it. The contrast with European maps reveals deeper philosophical divides. Where Mercator projections flatten the Earth into grids, songlines embrace curvature and connection. A single rock might be both a navigation marker and the resting place of an ancestral spirit, making geography inseparable from story. When colonial surveyors tried to transcribe these routes onto paper, they often failed, not because the knowledge was imprecise, but because pen and ink couldn't capture the interplay of myth, ecology, and direction. Modern scientists are now catching up. Studies show songlines align with star paths, migratory animal routes, and even seismic activity, suggesting generations of observation refined into oral GIS systems. Yet songlines aren't relics, they're thriving adaptations. Contemporary Aboriginal communities use them alongside digital tools, teaching drone pilots to overlay traditional routes with aerial surveys. In one striking example, rangers in Kakadu National Park combined GPS data with elder-led songline walks to identify endangered species habitats missed by satellite scans. The land sings where satellites go blind, a turtle nesting site revealed by a verse about tides, or a medicinal plant found where the melody mentions a specific shade of soil. The challenge songlines pose isn't just to mapping techniques, but to how we define knowledge itself. Western science prizes data divorced from context, while songlines declare that wisdom lives in the weave of place, memory, and responsibility. To follow a songline is to accept that you don't just move through the land, you answer to it. That's why attempts to preserve them in archives often falter. These maps don't just guide journeys, they demand them, renewing themselves with every step taken and every voice that carries them forward. In an age of climate crisis, songlines offer more than navigation, they model sustainability. Droughts that stump hydrologists, songline keepers often predicted them through verses referencing ant behavior or flower cycles. The irony is poignant. The world's oldest living culture may hold keys to navigating an uncertain future, not despite its orality, but because of it. Where our maps show borders, theirs show relationships, a reminder that every path is a conversation, and every traveler has a part to sing. The story of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas stepping onto Chinese soil in the year 638 isn't just about religion, it's about the quiet moments that reshape history. Picture the scene, a Persian envoy, weary from months of travel along the Silk Road, presenting himself at the Tang Dynasty court in Chang'an. The Emperor Xuanzang didn't see a threat or a foreign fanatic, he saw a scholar. According to Chinese records, the two men spent hours debating astronomy and medicine, their conversation flowing as smoothly as the ink in the imperial scrolls. When Sa'd finally revealed his true mission to introduce Islam, the emperor responded not with suspicion, but with curiosity. He granted permission to build the Great Mosque of Guangzhou, a structure that still stands today, its minaret echoing the pagodas of Tang architecture. This unlikely meeting reveals how East and West exchanged more than goods along the Silk Road. They traded ideas on their own terms. Unlike the forced conversions marking some religious expansions, Islam's arrival in China was a dialogue. The Tang court, already steeped in Buddhist and Taoist traditions, treated it as another thread in the empire's rich tapestry. Early Chinese Muslims, known as Hui, became cultural bridges. They mastered Confucian classics to qualify for imperial exams while quietly observing Ramadan. Their halal butchers adapted techniques from Sichuan cuisine, creating dishes like Lanju Niuru Mayan, beef noodle soup that satisfied both dietary laws and local palates. Even the mosque's design whispered compromise. Its courtyard followed Arab traditions, but the sweeping roof tiles were pure Tang Dynasty, a visual harmony of heaven and earth. The legacy of this exchange hides in plain sight. Walk through Xi'an's Muslim quarter today, and you'll smell cumin-dusted lamb skewers sizzling beside vendors selling mooncakes, a culinary fusion older than the Crusades. Peek into a Hui household, and you might find a Quran resting beside a statue of Guanyin, the Buddhist goddess of mercy. This isn't syncretism, it's something subtler, a coexistence where identities layer without erasing one another. When Mongol armies later swept through China, it was Hui scholars who preserved both Arabic medical texts and Tang poetry, proving that cultural guardianship knows no single creed. Yet the most enduring testament lies in language itself. Chinese Muslims developed a unique script called Xiaojing, using Arabic letters to write Mandarin phonetically. Children memorized the Quran not through rote translation, but by chanting verses in melodic Mandarin tones, turning scripture into a bridge between sounds and meanings. Even the word for mosque in Chinese Qingzhen Si translates to Temple of Pure Truth, a phrasing that resonated with Taoist ideals of harmony. Sa'd's mission succeeded precisely because it didn't seek to conquer, but to converse. The mosque he founded became a living archive of that spirit, its walls bearing inscriptions in both Arabic and classical Chinese, its imams fluent in the art of tea ceremony. In an age where divisions often dominate history's headlines, this quiet corner of Guangzhou whispers a different truth, that the greatest conversions aren't of faith, but of understanding. The Silk Road didn't just transport silks and spices, it carried the possibility that strangers could become neighbors, and that devotion, in any language, could feel like home. Thick fog blanketed the Viking longship, reducing the world to a swirl of grey. The crew's usual cues, the sun's arc, the stars' positions, had vanished. Yet the helmsman reached not for panic, but for a small, unassuming crystal tucked into his belt. Holding it aloft, he rotated it slowly until faint streaks of light aligned like ghostly sunbeams. With this, he adjusted their course, steering blindly yet confidently toward Greenland's distant shores. This wasn't magic, it was cutting-edge navigation technology from 1,000 years ago. The Icelandic sagas called it a solarstein, a sunstone. For centuries, historians dismissed it as legend until archaeologists unearthed a calcite crystal aboard a 16th-century English shipwreck. Suddenly, the myth gained scientific credibility. Calcite, or Iceland spar, has a property called birefringence. When light passes through it, the crystal splits into dual beams. By rotating the stone until these beams match in intensity, a navigator can pinpoint the sun's position even when it's completely obscured. Vikings didn't just stumble upon this trick, they mastered optics centuries before Snell's law explained refraction. But the sunstone was only one piece of a larger navigational puzzle. Viking wayfinding blended brute observation with sophisticated intuition. They tracked subtle shifts in wave patterns, noting how swells refract around distant islands like acoustic shadows. They memorized the flight paths of seabirds, fulmars nesting on the Faroe Islands, puffins returning to Iceland, letting biology chart their course. Even the color of the ocean held meaning. Sediment plumes from glacial rivers acted as liquid signposts. The sunstone didn't work in isolation. It was the keystone of a sensory navigation system attuned to nature's whispers. Modern experiments prove its startling accuracy. Researchers using replica sunstones under overcast Arctic skies have calculated latitude within a degree of error comparable to early sextants. A 2014 study even suggested Vikings might have combined the crystal with wooden shadow boards, casting faint light patterns to gauge solar altitude. This wasn't guesswork, it was reproducible science disguised as folklore. The real marvel isn't that Vikings crossed the Atlantic, it's that they did so with tools that blurred the line between tool and talisman. While Arab scholars were perfecting astrolabes and Chinese admirals relied on compasses, Norse sailors trusted a rock that turned fog into a roadmap. Their legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. The polarized sunglasses you might wear today exploit the same light-filtering principles. The next time clouds obscure your view, remember somewhere, a Viking ghost is nodding approvingly, his sunstone still catching light across a millennium. Ahmad ibn Fadlan never expected to become history's most unlikely Viking chronicler. When the Abbasid Caliph sent him north from Baghdad in 921, his mission was strictly diplomatic, to instruct the Volga Bulgars in Islamic law and assess potential alliances. But the moment his caravan reached the river's edge, he found himself plunged into a world stranger than any traveler's tale. There, amid the birch forests and swirling mists, loomed the Ruse, Viking traders whose longships carried furs, amber, and customs that left even the well-traveled Ibn Fadlan gaping in disbelief. His account reads like an anthropologist's fever dream. Where Arab merchants saw only barbarians, Ibn Fadlan recorded details with relentless precision. He described how the Rus towered over their Arab counterparts, their bodies tattooed from fingernails to necks with intricate patterns, their mourning rituals involving communal bowls of water where they blew their noses and spat, a habit he noted with horrified fascination. But it was their funeral rites that seared themselves into his memory. A chieftain's burial unfolded over 10 days of brutal spectacle, the sacrifice of horses and dogs, a slave girl who volunteered to join her master in death, and finally, the flaming longship pushed into the Volga's currents, its sails glowing like a second sunset. To Ibn Fadlan, this wasn't just exoticism, it was a mirror reflecting the vast spectrum of human belief. What makes his writings extraordinary isn't just their vividness, but their empathy. While other Muslim travelers dismissed Northern Europeans as filthy giants, Ibn Fadlan passed their logic. When he watched ruse traders pray to wooden idols for good prices, he didn't scoff, he recognized commerce as a universal language. His description of a merchant testing silver coins by biting them became a metaphor for cultural exchange itself, both sides assessing value through their own lenses. Even his revulsion at their hygiene habits carried a reluctant admiration for their hardiness, noting how they thrived in conditions that would have felled Baghdad's scholars. The irony, this accidental ethnographer nearly vanished from history. His original manuscript was lost for centuries, surviving only in fragments quoted by later geographers. When archaeologists unearthed a Viking chieftain's ship burial in Norway, they found eerie parallels to Ibn Fadlan's descriptions right down to the sacrificed animals and charred remains. Suddenly, this Arab bureaucrat became our most credible witness to Viking customs beyond the sagas. His account even inspired Michael Crichton's The 13th Warrior, though Hollywood took liberties with the facts. Ibn Fadlan's legacy isn't just about Vikings, it's about the power of curiosity to transcend prejudice. Where others saw barriers, he saw bridges. His pen captured a fleeting moment when the Silk Road's southern terminus connected with its northernmost reach, proving that even in an age of divides, there were those who looked past strangeness to find shared humanity. That's why his words still resonate, not as a relic but as a reminder that the greatest explorations aren't measured in miles but in understanding. Genghis Khan's empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, but his true masterpiece wasn't just conquest, it was communication. The Yam Network, a postal system so efficient it put modern couriers to shame, turned the vast Mongol steppes into a humming information superhighway. Picture this, a lone rider galloping across the frozen plains of Siberia, his horse lathered in sweat, a satchel of urgent dispatches strapped to his back. Before his mount could tire, he'd spot a relay station on the horizon, a cluster of yurts with fresh horses ready at full gallop. Without breaking stride, he'd leap onto a new steed and vanish into the dust, leaving his exhausted horse to recover while his message raced onward. These riders could cover 200 miles in a single day, a distance that would take European messengers weeks. The system's genius lay in its ruthless precision. Every 20 to 30 miles, a Yam station stood stocked with food, spare horses, and armed guards. The stations weren't optional rest stops, they were lifelines, strategically placed at intervals calculated by the average speed of a galloping horse. Each rider carried a paisa, a golden or silver passport that demanded absolute cooperation from local populations. Refusing to provide horses or supplies to a Yam courier wasn't just discourteous, it was punishable by death. This wasn't postal service, it was a military operation disguised as mail delivery. But speed wasn't the only innovation. The Mongols understood that information was only as good as its accuracy. To prevent tampering, messengers memorized critical communications verbatim, delivering them as oral transcripts rather than relying solely on written scrolls. For especially sensitive messages, they used cipher systems, shaving a messenger's head, tattooing the note onto his scalp, then letting his hair regrow before sending him on his way. By the time he arrived at his destination, the only way to read the message was to shave him again. Even Marco Polo marveled at their ingenuity. writing that the Yam could transport news from the empire's farthest corners to the Great Khan's court in under 2 weeks. Why did Europe lag so far behind? The answer lies in geography and governance. While medieval European kingdoms relied on patchworks of monastic scribes and merchant caravans, the Mongols treated information as a centralized resource. Their empire's sheer size demanded nothing less than perfection. Rebellions in Persia needed suppressing before they spread, and trade agreements in China required immediate ratification. The Yam didn't just carry letters, it ferried census data, tax records, and even perishable luxuries like fruit from the Caspian Sea to Karakoram, still fresh upon arrival. The system's collapse came not from inefficiency, but from the empire's fragmentation. As the Mongol Khanates fractured, maintenance of the Yam stations waned. Yet its legacy endured. The Russian yamshchiks of the 16th century, the Pony Express of the American West, all owed a debt to Genghis Khan's vision. In an age before telegraphs or trains, the Mongols proved that speed and connectivity weren't modern inventions, but ancient necessities. The next time you complain about a delayed package, remember, 8 centuries ago, a Mongol courier would have already crossed a mountain range by noon. Silax of Coriander dipped his oar into the churning waters of the Indus River, knowing his journey would rewrite the map of the ancient world. Commissioned by Persia's king Darius the Great in 515 BC, this Greek explorer wasn't just charting a river, he was unraveling a geographic mystery that had baffled empires for centuries. No one knew where the Indus led or what lands lay beyond its fertile banks. Silax's mission: follow its course to the sea, document every tribe and tributary, and return with intelligence that could turn Persia's territorial ambitions into reality. What he discovered would echo far beyond his lifetime, shaping the conquests of a young Macedonian king not yet born, Alexander the Great. The voyage was a feat of endurance and improvisation. Silax's fleet of reed boats, modeled after local designs, had to navigate shifting sandbars and monsoon-swollen currents. His logs, preserved in fragments by later Greek historians, describe encounters with kingdoms whose names, like Gandhara and Cambodia, would later appear in Alexander's battle plans. He noted the Indus split into multiple channels before emptying into the Arabian Sea, a delta so vast it seemed like a second Mesopotamia. But his most valuable insights weren't just geographic, they were cultural. He recorded how the region's fractured city-states warred constantly, their rivalries making them vulnerable to a unified invader. This detail wouldn't escape Darius's notice or Alexander's decades later. Persia's immediate use of Silax's findings was pragmatic. Darius annexed the Indus Valley, carving his claims onto the famous Behistun inscription alongside boasts of subduing the lands beyond the sea. But the true legacy of Silax's voyage lay in his written account, the Periplus, a navigational guide so detailed it became the ancient world's Google Maps for the East. By the time Alexander inherited a copy from his tutor Aristotle, it wasn't just a travelogue, it was a playbook. The young conqueror followed Silax's descriptions like a treasure map, targeting the very weak points the Greek explorer had identified. The divided kingdoms, the poorly defended river crossings, the cities rich in gold but lacking in unity. The parallels are striking. When Alexander reached the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, he faced King Porus and his war elephants, a scenario Silax had presciently described, noting the region's reliance on beasts that trample men like grass. Alexander's solution, a nighttime crossing using floating bridges, a tactic borrowed from Silax's notes on local fishing rafts. Even the Macedonians' decision to turn back at the Beas River, frustrating his troops' dreams of pushing eastward, may have been influenced by Scylax's warnings of impenetrable jungles and warriors who shoot poisoned thorns. Yet history remembers Alexander, not Scylax. Why? Because exploration rarely gets the glory of conquest. The Greek sailor's name faded into footnotes while Alexander's echoed through the ages. But peel back the layers of the Macedonians' campaigns, and you'll find Scylax's ghost at every turn, his maps guiding supply routes, his tribal accounts smoothing diplomatic talks, his river charts preventing logistical disasters. The Indus Valley wasn't conquered by sheer force. It was won by the accumulated knowledge of a man who'd sailed its waters 2 centuries earlier, proving that sometimes the quietest journeys cast the longest shadows. The next time you marvel at Alexander's brilliance, remember even legends need a roadmap. The snow leopards watched from the cliffs as Padmasambhava's caravan wound through the Himalayan passes, their breath fogging in the thin air. Known to Tibetans as Guru Rinpoche, the precious teacher, this Indian sage wasn't just crossing mountains, he was bridging worlds. The year was 841, and the Tibetan king Trisong Detsen had summoned him to tame the spirits blocking Buddhism's spread. But the journey itself became legend, each step embroidered with tales of supernatural trials that blurred the line between history and myth. Take the story of the Iron Bridge at Langtang. Local herdsmen warned of a gorge haunted by Drekong, serpentine demons that swallowed travelers whole. As Padmasambhava approached, the cliffs themselves seemed to shudder, until he struck his ritual dagger into the rock, chanting mantras that turned the writhing spirits into oath-bound protectors. To skeptics, it's a metaphor for conquering fear. To believers, proof of his mastery over the unseen. Even the bridge's construction defies logic. Medieval Tibetan texts describe it as forged from sky metal, a floating span too precise for 8th century engineering. Modern climbers still find rusted iron pegs embedded in sheer rock faces, their origins unexplained. Then there were the Dakini's celestial dancers said to guide him through blizzards. When his party lost their way near Mount Kailash, these spectral women appeared with bowls of nectar that banished altitude sickness. Science might call it hallucination induced by hypoxia, but the Pilgrims' journals tell another story. They describe finding ancient cairns marking hidden passes, their stones arranged in patterns matching constellations only visible from India. Coincidence? Or something more? The most chilling account comes from the Cave of Flames near the Nepal border. Villagers spoke of a cavern where fire erupted spontaneously, guarded by a sorcerer who challenged all holy men to debates. Losers were consumed by the flames. Padmasambhava didn't just survive, he transformed the cave into a meditation site, his handprint still visible on the soot-blackened wall. Geologists confirm the area has natural gas vents that could ignite, but locals insist the flames now only flare for the devout. What makes these tales endure isn't their fantasy, it's their grounding in real geography. Every supernatural site aligns with tangible landmarks, a sulfur spring here, a magnetic rock there. Even his legendary flight from Tibet, mounted on a tigress, corresponds to a hidden trail still used by Sherpas, its switchbacks resembling a predator's stripes from above. The miracles served a purpose. They made the Dharma unforgettable, turning a perilous route into a pilgrimage where every rock and river whispered lessons. Padmasambhava's greatest magic wasn't defying physics, it was weaving belief into the land itself. Today, when trekkers tie prayer flags at Rotang Pass or monks meditate in caves humming with subterranean winds, they're walking a path where history and wonder share the same footfalls. His journey reminds us that the wildest frontiers aren't just outside us, they're within, waiting to be crossed. The Alps had never seen anything like it. 37 war elephants, their massive feet crunching through early winter snow, their trunks curling and uncurling in the thin mountain air. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a spectacle of sheer audacity. In 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who'd sworn eternal hatred for Rome, did the unthinkable. He led 50,000 men, 9,000 cavalry, and those legendary elephants across some of the most treacherous terrain in Europe. The Romans, smug behind their belief that the mountains were their natural fortress, never saw it coming. But how did Hannibal pull off what should have been a logistical nightmare? The answer lies in a mix of ingenuity, psychology, and a willingness to bend nature to his will. First, consider the elephants. These weren't the massive African savanna elephants familiar to us today, but a smaller, now extinct species known as North African forest elephants, more agile, easier to train, and just as terrifying to enemies who'd never faced them. Hannibal's genius wasn't just in bringing them, it was in how he moved them. On steep ascents, his engineers carved steps into the rock, widening paths so the animals could pass single file. When the elephants balked at narrow ledges, handlers draped their eyes with cloth to prevent panic, guiding them like blindfolded giants through the abyss. And during river crossings, the Carthaginians built rafts camouflaged with earth and foliage, tricking the elephants into thinking they were still on solid ground. This wasn't brute force, it was behavioral science applied on a scale the ancient world had never witnessed. Then there was the weather. Hannibal didn't just cross the Alps, he outsmarted them. By timing his march for late autumn, he avoided the worst of the alpine storms, but early snowfall still caught his army off guard. Men and animals slipped on icy trails, tumbling into ravines. Yet Hannibal turned even this to his advantage. When his troops faltered, he rallied them with a speech so fiery it's still quoted millennia later. "You're climbing the walls not just of Italy, but of Rome itself." And when the snow blocked their path, he ordered vinegar poured onto boulders, then set them ablaze. The chemical reaction cracked the stone, clearing the way, a trick likely learned from Eastern traders who'd used similar methods in the Himalayas. But the real masterstroke was psychological. Hannibal knew the Alps were as much a mental barrier as a physical one. By crossing them, he didn't just surprise Rome, he shattered its aura of invincibility. The moment his emaciated but triumphant army descended into the Po Valley, the message was clear: no natural obstacle could stop Carthage. The Gauls, who'd long resisted Rome, flocked to his banner, swelling his ranks. And those elephants, they became living propaganda, their very presence demoralizing Roman troops who'd been told such a crossing was impossible. The cost, though, was staggering. By the time Hannibal reached Italy, half his men and nearly all his elephants had perished. Yet the gamble paid off in ways that echoed far beyond his lifetime. His Alpine crossing became the ultimate lesson in turning geography into theater, proving that the greatest military victories aren't just about strength, they're about making the impossible seem inevitable. When later conquerors, from Napoleon to Patton, studied his campaign, they weren't just admiring tactics, they were learning how to bend perception itself. Hannibal's Alps weren't just crossed, they were conquered twice, first by feet and tusks, then by the unstoppable force of a legend in the making. The greatest legacy of ancient explorers isn't etched in maps or monuments, it pulses invisibly through our daily lives. Every spice in your kitchen, every word borrowed between languages, even the constellations guiding modern satellites trace back to these pioneers who stared into the unknown and stepped forward. What united them wasn't just courage, but a shared refusal to accept the world as it was presented. Phoenician merchants braving Atlantic storms, Polynesian navigators reading wave patterns like poetry, Zhang surviving a decade of captivity to unlock the Silk Road. Their stories diverge in time and place, but converge in a singular truth: exploration is the antidote to stagnation. Consider the tangible threads they wove across civilizations. When Roman gourmets sprinkled pepper on their feasts, they were tasting the fruits of Hippolytus's monsoon voyages. The intricate gears of Islamic astrolabes, which later powered Europe's age of discovery, built upon celestial knowledge gathered by Arab scholars like Al-Idrisi in Sicily's multicultural courts. Even distrust couldn't stifle curiosity. Viking traders and Arab chroniclers like Ibn Fadlan met as strangers, yet their accounts became irreplaceable puzzle pieces in reconstructing lost worlds. These weren't solitary triumphs, they were collaborations across centuries, where each journey added another stitch to the tapestry of human connection. Yet resilience alone didn't guarantee success. For every Leif Erikson establishing a fleeting Viking settlement in Vineland, there were countless others swallowed by deserts or seas, their names forgotten. What set the enduring explorers apart was adaptability, the willingness to learn as much as to conquer. Zheng He's treasure fleets carried not just silks, but scribes to document foreign customs. Xuanzang survived bandits and blizzards by mastering local languages, turning hostility into hospitality. The Greenland Norse, by contrast, vanished because they clung to cattle farming while their Inuit neighbors thrived on seal hunting, a stark lesson in the cost of inflexibility. Today, their spirit lives in unexpected places. Astronauts training for Mars cite Polynesian Wayfinding as inspiration for navigating without GPS. Epidemiologists trace disease spread using models based on Silk Road trade routes. Even the internet, with its data superhighways, mirrors the Mongol Yam Network's relay stations. The explorers' most enduring gift wasn't territory claimed, but perspectives shifted. They proved that borders are human illusions, and curiosity is the truest compass. So what's next? As we peer into ocean trenches and distant galaxies, we're still answering the same primal call that drove Hano along Africa's coast or sent Mies Titianus toward the stone tower. The tools have changed, but the essence remains. To explore is to choose hope over fear, to bet on the possibility that what lies beyond will redefine what we thought possible. The ancient explorers whisper across time, reminding us that every frontier once crossed becomes somebody's home. As we close this epic saga of ancient explorers, remember that their stories are more than history, they're testaments to human ingenuity. Each tale, from Hano's African coast to Zheng He's armadas, reminds us that the unknown has always called to the bold. These pioneers didn't just cross oceans and deserts, they shattered the limits of what their societies believed was possible, transforming fear into fascination and blank spaces on the map into vibrant crossroads of culture and commerce. Think about the ripple effects of their journeys. When Pythias described the midnight sun to skeptical Greeks, he wasn't just sharing a travel anecdote, he was expanding humanity's understanding of the planet. When Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir gave birth in Vineland, she wasn't just a mother, she was the first European to plant the seed of a new world, however briefly. And when Ibn Battuta logged 75,000 miles across medieval Afro-Eurasia, he wasn't merely collecting passport stamps. He was weaving a tapestry of interconnectedness that still shapes our globalized world today. But here's the twist: exploration isn't confined to the past. The same spirit that drove Polynesian navigators to read the stars now fuels scientists decoding the human genome or engineers designing probes for Mars. Your uncharted territories might be a language you've always wanted to learn, a skill you're afraid to try, or even a conversation with someone whose life seems worlds apart from yours. The essence of exploration lies not in the scale of the journey, but in the willingness to step beyond what's familiar. So let's turn the page together. Which of these tales resonated most with you? Was it Zhang Cayenne's resilience after years of captivity, or perhaps the quiet brilliance of Ban Zhao's Silk Road Survival Guide? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're all curators of history, and your perspective adds another layer to these stories. And if you're hungry for more adventures, hit that subscribe button. The past is vast, and we've only just begun to explore its hidden corners. Until next time, keep your compass curious and your horizons wide. The greatest discoveries aren't behind us. They're waiting for whoever